Morning. Today is Sunday, the 8th day of Teves. We begin today chapter 7 in the Likutei Amarim in the Tanya. What we learned in the last chapter, the Alter Rebbe described the makeup of the animal soul, starting to explain that the animal soul is something that receives you have the makeup corresponds, it's parallel to the godly soul, which means just like the godly soul has 10 faculties, has the intellectual faculties and creates emotional faculties, so too the animal soul has, he calls it the 10 crowns of impurity, because each one is like a separate crown, separate entity for itself. Does not intertwine, is not inclusive with others. The 10 different faculties. And they are divided into the emotional and to the intellectual as well. Except there is a difference between the godly soul and the animal soul. When the godly soul is said, the intellect, everything is based on the intellectual soul. The intellectual faculties create the emotional. Whereas by the animal soul, he says that it first addresses the emotional faculties, and he says they derive from intellectual. And the difference is because in the animal soul, everything is based on the emotions, because just like an animal is seeking its own pleasures, its own goods, same thing here, the animal soul is looking and seeking only what's good for its own animalistic desires. So you don't have to work hard to develop a desire to material things. It comes natural. Natural from the day you're born, you want all material things. Ask any baby, when you give him a candy, he wants the candy. Whatever it sees and it feels like it wants, it doesn't have to develop a taste to it. When it comes to the godly soul, it doesn't come on its own. It goes through the understanding. You have to work to appreciate godliness. You have to work, and then you develop the desire to be godly, to connect to godliness. So here, the Alter Rebbe explained yesterday, the part of the Tanya which we learned on Shabbos, that we didn't learn on Friday. Alter Rebbe talks about when the animal soul comes from when a person is involved in the materialistic things, and he uses the 3 garments of the soul into things that are not godly. What are the 3 garments? The thoughts, the speech, and the action. When you use those 3 garments in things that are not godly. And he explained, what does it mean, things that are not godly? There is the Kedusha, there is the holy side, and there's the other side. Anything which is not godly is the other side. And so those things, when it basically what it does, it brings the garments of the soul are enclosed the klipa, the other side, the impurity are enclosed into the machshava, dibur, maaseh, the thought, speech, and action, the garments of the animal soul. And then the Alter Rebbe started telling us about the klipa. When we're talking about the other side, which is not godly, there's 3 categories. There is what it's called the sholish klipes atmeyos, the 3 other impurities, which is the root and the life, the sustenance, where all the things that are against God, things that are impure, things that are not kosher, that has no good quality to them. they come from the Sholosh Klipis Atmeis. And he gave examples. He gave examples of food that are not kosher, and animals that are not kosher. And what he did not mention, he didn't mention the inanimate objects. Why not? Because the inanimate objects, there's no such thing of an inanimate object coming from the total impurity. It can become total impurity when a person uses them for negative things. Let's say a rock or something, an idol that is used for idol to become an idol, then that inanimate object becomes the total impure. But when it comes to by nature, by creation, the inanimate objects does not come in form of total impurity, not unlike the other elements, that are things that are vegetations. You can have vegetations that are also connected with the total impurity. For example, the fruits that are considered orla. Orla means the first 3 years of the fruits in Eretz Israel. They are completely impure. And the same thing is with animals, non-kosher animals. Same thing with humans. When you have the soul that comes from totally impurity. So, but the inanimate object does not come from the total impurity, unless you make it so. And the explanation why is the difference? Is in the sense when we explained on Friday the difference between holiness and unholiness. What is holiness? Anything that is nullified, that doesn't have its selfish existence. It's completely nullified to Hashem. Any other creature in this world, whether it's human, whether it's animals, and even vegetation, doesn't have this complete self-nullification, had its own growth, has its own selfishness. The inanimate object is an object that God created, but it's completely nullified to the one above, unless you take it and use it into a negative way. But ultimately, the Alter Rebbe explained also, even in those objects that come from the total impurity, nevertheless, lest we lose hope and say, if we live in such a world that is filled with things, objects, and creations that are, as the Alter Rebbe says, it's Rashoim Govrim Boy, the evil things are the majority and they overpower the not good overpowers the good. So we can lose hope and say, how can we ever succeed in such a world? How can we ever make it better and purify and make the world a good world? So for that, Alter Rebbe explained yesterday that really in every single creature, even in the lowest creature, there is inside it originally comes from the Spheres of Atzilus. Except that it was through the filtering and going down so low, it became completely opposing Hashem. But the fact that we know that there is the godliness in it, that itself gives us the hope, gives us the understanding that we are able ultimately to change. And today's chapter, the Alter Rebbe begins to explain the Nefesh Achiyunis, the vital soul, and explaining the fact that the klipa, the shell that is called the klipas noiga, where yesterday we explained the shell of the ultimate impure shell, sholish klipas atmeis, the 3 impure shells, that in essence our way of dealing with it is to avoid it completely and to break it, not to use them, not kosher things, thoughts that are not kosher, speech that are not good, those things that we stay away from. And today he's explaining the klipas noiga. The klipas noiga is that shell that can potentially be elevated. That noiga means also light, means a shine, that has some shine to it also. So potentially can be elevated, and this is our job, what we need to do. So let's look inside in today's Shir and Tanya. So this is again the beginning of chapter 7. Says the Alter Rebbe, Ach nefesh achiyunis abahamis shebe Yisrael shemetzad haklipe amelubeshes b'dam ha'odam keniskaleil. However, unlike the life forms mentioned at the conclusion of chapter 6, which are derived from the 3 holy unclean klippas, the following life forms are derived from klipas noiga. What is klipas noiga? The vitalizing animal soul in the Jew, which is derived from the side of klipa and which clothes itself in the human being's blood, providing him with physical life, as stated above. So this comes from the klipas noiga. That potential, that klipa that can potentially be purified and elevated. And the same thing is also v'nafshais, behemes, v'chayes, v'oifes, v'dogim, tehoirim, v'motorim achile. And the souls of the animals, beasts, birds, and fish, which are pure according to the laws of the Torah, and are thus permitted for Jewish people for consumption. So the life force of these animals, is also the existence and vitality of everything in the inanimate and vegetable world that is permissible for consumption. So here you notice, here it does mention the inanimate objects. Because the inanimate object, when he spoke about the total impurities, he didn't mention the inanimate object because there are no total impure inanimate objects. But here he's talking about the level of impurity, which is klipas noiga, that can potentially be elevated. And there he does mention as well the inanimate objects that can be consumed, like for example, salt, water, those are also things that can be consumed and that are kosher, and therefore they come from that part of klipa, which is called the klipas noiga, the potentially good. The same thing also, v'chein kiyum v'chayus kol ha'maaseh dibur u'machashava v'inyanei olam hazeh she'ein behem tzad isur. So too, the existence and vitality of every act, utterance, and thought in mundane matters that contain no forbidden aspects. So the energy that we have when we speak, when we think, when we do whatever we do, whatever we think and whatever we speak, the energy is an energy that comes from this klipa, if it's not forbidden. If it's a non-kosher act, speech, or thought, if it's speak of lashon hara, for example, or thoughts that are not kosher thoughts, the energy that animates this thought, speech, and action come from the total impurities. But if it's something that is not forbidden, then it comes from the klipas noiga. And again, we're not talking about holy thoughts. We're talking about just thoughts that are not forbidden. And it has no aspects of forbidden. Being neither root nor branch of the 365 prohibitive precepts and their offshoots, prohibited either on explicit authority of the Torah or by the rabbinic enactment, because we have 365 negative mitzvahs, but there's also branches and offshoots of those mitzvahs. So there's a lot of details. Some of them are biblical, some of them are rabbinical. So we're talking about something that has nothing of these forbidden thoughts or action or speech. Rak, however, she'enim l'shem shamayim, yet when these permitted thoughts, utterances, and acts are not performed for the sake of heaven. Instead, they're only the will and desire and lust of the body. You're doing something, you're eating something, a sandwich. You just desire to have it. Even if you're doing it for good reasons, because you want to be healthy. Still, it belongs to the klipa, to the not good side, the potentially not good side. He says, "Afilu tzerech hagufay v'kiyuma v'chayusay mamash," and even where it is a need of the body and necessary for its very preservation in life, such as eating, which the body requires for its very existence, and without which it cannot possibly live. Thus, the act itself cannot be faulted. Elo, however, but the fault lies in this, in that his intention is not for the sake of heaven, meaning to utilize his body as an instrument in the service of Hashem. So if this is not what he has in his mind, says the Alter Rebbe, lo yadife ma'aseh dibur machshavas elim enefesh achiyunis aba'amis be'atzma. In this spiritual intent, if this spiritual intent is absent, then all these acts, utterances, and thoughts are no better than the vitalizing animal soul itself. Meaning that they come from the animal soul, they come from that same source. Just like the animal soul comes from the place which is klipas noiga, the same thing, those thoughts and speech and actions, they come from the same place. והכל כאשר לכל נמשך ונשפע ונמשך ממדרגה השניס שבקליפס וסתרא אחר שהיא קליפה רביעיס הנקראת קליפס נויגה. He says everything in this totality of things, meaning the soul with its actions, utterances, and thoughts, the flows and is drawn from the second gradation of klipas and sitra achra, which is the progressively ascending order of klipas, the fourth klipa called klipas noiga. So it's the fourth klipa because we said the first level of klipas is the three ultimate impure klipas, and the fourth klipa is called the klipas noiga. The klipas noiga is that klipa, that shell that has a potential to shine, has a ray of holiness in it. But until you elevate it, it's still klipa, it's still a shell, it's still concealing godliness. For in this world, called the world of Asiya, the world of action, most, indeed almost all of the klipas nega is evil, with only a little good intermingled within it. And that little good brings us the good characters. For this minute amount of good within the klipas noiga comes the good qualities which are found in the animal soul of a Jew, as explained above. In the first chapter, we explained this. This level of klipas noiga, says the Alter Rebbe, this is the intermediary. This intermediates between the level of holiness and the level of total impurity. Klipas nega is an intermediate category between the three completely unclean klipas and the category and order of sanctity. and therefore, פעמים שהיא נכללת בשלוש קליפות הטמאות, ופעמים, כמו שכתוב בעץ חיים, שם מ"ט ריש פרק ד' בשם הזויה, ופעמים שהיא נכללת ואוילו בחינס מדרגת הקדושה. Hence, it is sometimes absorbed within the three unclean klippas, as explained in Eitz Chaim, Portal 49, beginning of chapter 4, citing in the Zoya. And at the other times, it is absorbed in and elevated to the category of level of sanctity. That's what it is. It can be down, it can drawn down, and can be elevated up to the holiness. The high know, when does it happen? When is it absorbed into holiness? That is, it is absorbed within sanctity, when the good that is intermingled in it is extracted and separated from the evil, prevails over it, and ascends to be absorbed in sanctity. And it gives us an example. It gives us an example. Kegoin derech mashal. For example, oichel bisra shmeina de Torah v'shoise yain mevusam leharchiv daitoi laHashem lavidasa. If one eats fat beef and drinks spiced wine, not out of physical desire, but in order to broaden his mind for the service of God and for his Torah. As the sage Rava said, wine and fragrance make the mind more receptive. So if you want to come to a shiur and want to understand properly the class well, eat a piece of meat, drink some wine, open up your mind. I don't know what the dietitians today will say about it, but in any case, it is something that when you eat this, it opens up your mind. You'll be able to understand better. So that's one example of using what we said, the meat and the wine is something that belongs to the klipa sneiga. It is not, it is kosher, so it's a klipa, it is a shell, but it's potentially good. And when you use it out, to use the energy to be able to study Torah better, then you are elevating the godly spark, that shine that is in this meat, in this wine, and is being elevated. And it brings in another example. The other example is when you eat and drink to enjoy the meal on Shabbos. Oy, that's what he says, Oy bishvil kedei lekayim mitzvahs oinek Shabbos v'yom tov. Or in order to fulfill the commandment to enjoy the Shabbos and the festivals. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, when you eat, the pleasure itself is a mitzvah. Not only the intent of what is going to be with the meat, but the pleasure itself is a mitzvah. Azai, and then, Nizbarer chayus abasa v'ayayin shoyanishpa mil klipas noiga v'oile Hashem k'oile v'kom. When one eats and drinks in the above-mentioned manner, then the vitality of the meat and the wine, which originated in klipas noiga, is then extracted from the evil and ascends to God like a burnt offering and sacrifice. It's interesting over here. It brings the example. It says like a burnt offering and sacrifice. Isn't a burnt offering a sacrifice? So the explanation is there's actually two types of sacrifice. More than two types, but here it's talking about two types of sacrifices. There's a burnt offering. The burnt offering is an offering that brought to the temple and is completely burnt and consumed to Hashem. The Cohens do not eat this offering. Then there is other type of sacrifice, like an offering of a korban todah, for example, shlamim. Those are peace offerings. Those are types of offerings that part of it goes on the altar and being consumed, and part of it is eaten by the Cohens, even some by the owners, the ones who brings the offering also eat some of the offerings. So here, this also is in the example. When we use this as a burnt offering, is also the different ways of eating food with a proper intent to elevate it to Hashem. There's food that you eat during the week when you want to have, you're using it to be able to study better, to be able to serve Hashem better. This is a type of eating that the eating itself, the pleasure, if you eat it for the pleasure is not going up to Hashem. The pleasure is your selfish thing. What goes up to Hashem is when you have the intent that the energy you have from this food, you're going to use it in a proper way. Then it's a part of it goes up, but the pleasure doesn't go up. This is like the gift offering, that you have some and some goes to Hashem. Then you have the food that you eat on Shabbos. Food that you eat on Shabbos and the holidays, the pleasure itself also goes up to Hashem because there's a mitzvah to have the pleasure. Not only the energy that you're going to use it for proper use, but the pleasure itself. That is why he calls it these two examples of the burnt offering and the korban and the sacrifice. Continues the Alter Rebbe. So too, concerning speech, the vitality of words spoken for a sacred purpose ascends and is absorbed in sanctity. For example, when you speak, I want to make a joke. So he says, he who makes a humorous remark to sharpen his mind and make his heart rejoice in God and his Torah, and his Torah service, which should be practiced joyfully. So if you make a humorous remark because you want everybody to open up the mind, you create a closeness, open the mind so they can receive the teaching that you're going to teach now. You have your mind more open. That itself also is the words that seems to be mundane, but they're being used into being elevated into the holiness. As Rava was wont to do with his pupils, prefacing his discourses with a humorous remark, whereupon the student became cheerful and thereby more receptive and better able to understand the discourse. So those are the examples that the Rebbe brings when it comes to klipas nega, when it comes to the mundane things. The mundane things comes from something which is neutral. It is the bridge between the ultimate impure and the holiness. And it is up to us to use everything what we do, when we speak, when we eat, when we think, to use it. When you use it in a proper way, you're elevating the godly sparks and bring it in. End of today's share. Thank you all for joining. We shall continue Mitzvah Shem tomorrow. Join us at the new time, 9:10 a.m. Any questions?